Okay, fantastic. Hello, good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in and watching. You all know who I am by now, and I'm sure you also know my guest, Mike Schussler, one of our top premier elite economists. And Mike has taken time out of his busy schedule to speak to us about something that I think is incredibly important for all South Africans, especially now at the beginning of July. We've just exited the hardest of the hard lockdown. We're still technically in a pseudo hard lockdown, and people are concerned about getting back to work, becoming productive again, restarting the engines of industry and commerce, so to speak. And Mike, would you like to please? Well, good morning to you. Thank you for being here. Firstly, let me not be rude. And would you like to just jump straight in, and we can talk about where a bit of a cross-sectional snapshot about where are we right now at the beginning of July?
Well, we are in the worst situation. Let's put it this way: we were in the worst situation probably in April, May, and we are getting out of that really bad situation. It is impeded a bit by a few factors. Lots of people cannot go to work yet because their children are at home. So if you've got a child in grade 3 and grade 3 is not going back to school right now, it's very difficult for some people to get to work. So that's the extent of our lockdown more than anything else. Yes, you can't get alcohol in a restaurant, and you can't go to gym. So there's still some, and you can't go between provinces and tour the Kruger Park or whatever. And it's still impacting on obviously air travel and all the tourism type stuff. But I think the biggest impact at the moment is that people can't go away from home when their children are not going to school. That's the one broader part of the lockdown that's just taking its time. But having said all these, let's call it realistic things, the other realism is that we are slowly moving out of that. All the indicators are that picking up. April was clearly the worst. In some places, it was a bit of May as well. And certainly by June, we'd gathered back, sort of 85% of what we had lost, I would say. Not quite, maybe, but near enough. And this quarter, we'll see magnificent growth, but it's obviously coming from a very, very low base. And next quarter, we'll see good growth as well, but not probably as good as this quarter because this is just a bounce back. So any bounce back starts with a V, if you wish. And then after that, you stretch out a bit, I think. So that's what we're looking at in this pandemic. So we're looking like a swoosh from Nike, and it's going to take a long time for us to get really back where we were before. And never mind that we had to, we want growth because we've got people growth. We've got 1.5% more people every year. So for us to get back to the economy back on track was probably 2 years, maybe even 3-4 years. But for us to get back to the same per capita GDP as we had in 2014, we're going to take a long time, probably a decade. Because if you don't grow 1.5% every year, you lose out. So we're probably going to decline with about 9%, 10% this year in GDP overall. And what that would mean is that effectively, say it's 10%, we would effectively all be on average 11.5% poorer because there's also people growth. So that's where the economy is. There are parts of the economy, I think, that are doing better. Certainly in the first quarter, we saw agriculture do a very nice comeback. It was important because they've had a horrible 2-3 years. To me, the mining industry is really in trouble at the moment. And that is despite our minerals fetching really good prices, especially gold. There's a bit of a bounce back from platinum. Iron ore and coal are going to struggle for a while because there are huge stocks in China of iron ore. And I think coal is becoming the bad boy of electricity, really is. And but mining is really in terrible shape because that's where COVID can hit easily. It's a lot of people in a close confined space. So it's a breeding ground for the virus, if you wish. and people are going to be ultra careful because they don't want to be sued. And so mining, I think, is going to take, as the Minerals Council said, they don't expect to get there back to usual before September. And I think they're probably being a bit optimistic, and it'll take another 2-3 months. And only then do you gear up for full production. Manufacturing, it's difficult to say because we don't have everything. But certainly, I think the older style manufacturing like steel industries, metal, and so on, is struggling. We cannot compete. That's nothing to do with COVID. Now it's becoming more difficult. Then we've got clothing that's been decimated. But at the other end, we're doing quite well in some specialty areas of food. And for example, COVID destroyed the wine industry, the lockdown specifically. It was madness. And it was one of our better performing industries for a long time. And, it's that area and nuts. Those are sort of strange areas for South Africa to be in, perhaps, but we're starting to see that grow. The avo trees, the date trees in the Northern Cape, the table grapes, all that is really interesting. Even apples from Harrismith, which have got a 3-week window every year into Europe. So yeah, we can make nice juices, we can make all those sort of things. So there's some positive, let's just put it that way. The financial industry is very strong, but I think after this year they'll be much more careful, because I think the thing with banks is they don't make money when you give them money and they pay you interest. You're a liability to them, and they make money when they lend money, and the lending is not going to take place in many areas, and people are holding back cash. So their margins are going to come under pressure in the next year or two still. So that's going to be a long time. We've seen the restaurant industry and hotel industry, aeroplanes. That's going to take a long time. I don't think we're going to see aeroplanes as we did, say, last year's level for another 2 years. People are just too scared. And the irony is, we need that because a lot of high-end valuable goods that we use every day, like cell phones, chips for our computers, medicines, flowers, all that flies on planes. So you have this strange situation where literally 1 or 2% of the volume of goods worldwide go by air, but it's 34% of value. So it's the high end. And that is being decimated. We've got, we smooth it, so it's not all there yet, but it looks like a 44% or 41% decline so far up to May. But in June, it'll be a bigger decline because March, which was still, only a small decline, will fall out. And you'll probably end up with about a 60-70% decline. You look at India, and that's an 82% decline in air freight. And they measure it monthly as well. So it just shows you, it's been hectic on that industry specifically. Then obviously the travel industry, passengers and so on. And I think you can even pick it up in many others, whether it's shipping and so on. So on the transport side, we do see which parts are struggling really a lot. And that's where we are. We are in a situation where something like air freight and air travel, I think air freight can get back quicker, but air freight needs that passenger travel because the passenger is one part of the aeroplane and the cell phones are another part of the aeroplane, just to put it in, and both need each other because otherwise that aeroplane is not making money. So some industries like that will take a while, not forever. And very much about aeroplanes, I understand. So I'll leave it there. But I think that's an interesting thing how that's going to play out. And maybe it will be the first time that freight, again for about 100 years, because remember airplanes used to do post, will be leading the way back because cell phones aren't going away. Computers aren't going away, not now, because people want them at home and everywhere, want to be more connected. So I don't see all those sort of high value stuff. It needs the air sector. At the other end, the agricultural sector, in the general food sense, has been least impacted. Although, if you look at the chicken industry, they'll tell you about 20% of their sales disappeared because of the fast foods. They sell a lot into the KFCs and the Nando's and so on, and they buy a lot of South African chicken. So that's very perfect. And then just the travel between countries has become enormously problematic for trucks. Sometimes the wait has been over 2 weeks for a truck driver in quarantine. Sometimes it's just a queue of 12, 13 kilometers, which takes 3 days. So where a truck driver was working for himself, just to give you an idea, and they do, a lot of them, they would take a load of chrome down to Mozambique every day, there and back, from the eastern part of our country. And now they can only do one load every 3 or 4 days. So, now you've cut that person's income potential by 2/3 or 3/4. So, yeah, there's a lot of coming back still. We need to sort out things. Some things, if we can sort out that border, we can sort out a few things, we can get that machinery working. Once that works, the guy will again service the truck maybe, you employing the mechanic, and the mechanic then can buy himself a bigger voucher from the telecom operator, and he can send his wife some flowers or whatever the case may be. So if we can just pick up stuff going through borders, and if we can pick up other parts, it'll be great. But we are on the way back. So I suspect that we'll get back to 95% or from where we were by the end of the year, easy. It's those last few 4 or 5% that's going to be the difficult part.
And that's a lot more significant than I think it necessarily sinks into people, because if you talk, okay, last 3, 4, 5%, people think, okay, this isn't really that significant. But for those who missed the earlier part of Mike explaining to us our present position, to get back to where we were in 2014 as a point of welfare would be, what, a decade, roughly?
Yep.
That's how long it would take to recover to where we were 6 years ago. Now, in comparison to other emerging markets, you sent me a lot of really interesting graphs yesterday. One of the ways we can measure future outlook is what a country gets in net cross-border direct investment. And unfortunately, the picture for South Africa is a bit of an outlier, because out of a whole bunch on this one graph, which I'm going to put on the screen for us, let me just do that actually. There we go. And pop it on. South Africa is the only one out of this entire collection of countries that has a negative cross-border net direct investment of like minus 108 billion US dollars. Mm-hmm. And what would be the reason for this, Mike?
Well, it's multitude. We'll talk about taxes later, because I know I sent you a tax graph.
You did.
But the first part is obviously, why China is doing so well in India is they've got large populations and are growing quickly. That's why they're outperforming everybody. But, we've sort of performed similar to Brazil, and maybe in a way, definitely a bit better than Argentina, similar to at stages Turkey and Egypt maybe. So we should have had more. And the thing is that if you have a government that fights with business the whole time, and that makes too many rules for business to feel comfortable with, money finds a way to flow away. And that's exactly what we have in South Africa now. Sometimes it's a great opportunity, and I'm using a company now, not because I want you to buy it, I don't do that, but MTN went into Africa and there was lots of opportunity for them there. Yes, they've come up against hurdles and everything, but there was a reason they did it. Other companies, I think, just didn't see the growth potential and were very worried about South Africa. So now we have 70% of the turnover of the JSE, of the big companies of the JSE, is earned outside of South Africa. So whether it is, some cases, Namibia, our neighbor, and so on, small, but I mean, it all adds up. And if you go and look at where they're spending to lift their earnings, in many cases, it's now overwhelmingly in the foreign markets. And you can look at a Lake Charles from Sasol. Yes, it was a mess of a thing, but it is a very big thing. The other thing is, why are we so negative? Well, there's two countries there. The second last one is Malaysia, and they had a localization policy as well. And a localization policy is like our BEE. So we say, you can put your money here, but we want you to give away something to us, apart from taxes and everything. And businesses, when they make their calculations, they say, fine, I can accept that you have a labor force and that I have to pay them and everything. But what they're generally not used to is there's somebody who says, oh, well, you're going to have a partner that you don't know.
Yeah, you don't know who they
are. We are going to introduce you to this partner, and this partner is going to come and they're going to do something for you. But actually they don't. They're just there. They might get you a government contract or two, but you give up part of your company, or you give up part of your earnings, or you have to adhere to certain employment standards as well on top of everything else. And this is not like Black Lives Matter type of thing. This is very simple economics. This is people saying, but I don't want to go there. If that, why must I learn these extra rules? And that's why Malaysia has let go of the rules. And where, like South Africa, 3-4 years ago, they were still negative, they've now gone positive. And net direct investment is not portfolio flows. They are certainly, they're now third from the bottom. Colombia has also had a bit of a war, as we know, a civil war. So even a country with a civil war gets more than we do. Makes you think.
So we've got an incredible negative before the 108 billion. It's a big minus.
Yeah, so it means our companies have created more jobs overseas than we have, than foreign companies have here. And it is normally and we're the only emerging market of the big ones to have invested more in other countries than they've invested here. So if you look at the investment that we're missing, if we want to go to 25-30%, which is the norm for many, many, many emerging markets, then you can say that's 3 million jobs at R1 million each. And, you know, it's an incredibly stupid thing to have done. I think, but our conversation hasn't reached that level yet, and it's very difficult because people feel that you attacking black people and government and all that. What I'm saying is actually this policy is destroying jobs, and the majority of those jobs are black, and it is very it is very unuseful to point out this sort of thing because it's not politically correct. But it's also unuseful, or even more unuseful, for them not to hear the truth. Because when you speak to foreign businesses, and I don't speak to the big ones, but I speak to a lot of smaller ones, they don't get all this. They say, but I wasn't here then. Or you even look at young South Africans who say, I wasn't born during apartheid, so I'm not here, I'm not interested. And I want to start a business. So I think we've got to relook at that whole picture and say to ourselves, why don't we just let businesses be? Employ AA policies if you have to, fine. That's not the people around the world do that. But this localization policy where people have to give up something for something else means that your local businesses and the foreign ones are not interested. And the money flows to other places, and with the money, the jobs flow. And with the jobs, also the taxes flow. And the potential for a better education, the potential for a better health service. So that is the crucial point in South Africa that we have to learn.
That it brings me back to my economic textbook, actually, my macroeconomics one, where there was an interview with Robert E. Lucas in the 1980s, I think. And the journalist asked him a very straightforward question. We could have given a very complicated answer. And the question was, why is Africa's growth and development so substandard compared to the rest of, other emerging market economies? Why is the continent in general not keeping up? And then he kind of laughed and he said, it's because Africa has terrible politics. And that was his one sentence answer. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a large part, but much of Africa is growing much quicker today because they've gone away from the localization politics. They're trying to beat corruption and they're trying to get their people the best deal possible. So we've seen a change in much of Africa. I'm not saying the politics of Ethiopia is ideal or anything, but you see the great growth that Ethiopia has had from where we thought they were very thin people and starving when Michael Jackson and then What We Are the World, we sang about it. And then we look at the impact of other African countries. Yes, the oil countries are now suffering a bit, but there's Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania. They're all growing at least at rates far, far above South Africa. And I think that situation has got to be studied. I think very often Africa can today teach us, and us, I mean South Africa, probably Namibia, and so on. And we can learn from Botswana. But the point of the matter is that the ones that haven't done well are mainly in Southern Africa at the moment, and with the weakest growth rates in the last decade or so. So it's around us. It's in the SACU countries, the SADC countries. And we've now got one very big success story. Mauritius is now the first high-income country in Africa. So they've done something right. Morocco, I think, has been okay. Yes, there's been north of the Sahara, there's been riots, and Libya's at war. It doesn't mean that they're all successful. But one has seen success in places like Ghana. One has seen success in Rwanda. And I think we mustn't take that for granted. We must say, as Africans, we should be learning from the African continent too. And the African continent, I think, learned from that textbook, or some of them did.
Yeah.
The problem is we're very late in this party, and we don't understand yet how late we are.
No, and unfortunately, I'll bring up another, because we also said the taxation graph, by the way, I can't find for some reason, but we'll talk about that.
No problem.
But the other one is this gross domestic product to quarter one 2020 versus quarter one 2019. And let me just pop that on the screen for us, because this is actually quite a good one as well. And it kind of puts us again into, how shall we say it? There we go. Puts us into a bit of perspective here with regards to what places like the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the rest of them are doing. Unfortunately, I think we're the only African country on this graph, but
yeah. I'm sorry about that. I can tell you now that yes, we this was an idea. I had wanted to have a look at what the corona impact is, and on a year-on-year basis, China is down from where they were, but you can see everybody's still growing. But here, most of the emerging markets are, even Sweden and the United States, and South Korea, which is definitely developed now, and Taiwan, how they've handled the coronavirus. Those with severe lockdowns, like Italy and France and Spain, and remember their lockdown started earlier than us, have had very poor outcomes. We were in a poor situation, so we are already on the negative side. Asia has been downgraded now again. But the interesting thing is that the IMF and the Asian Development Bank and so on still think there's going to be a smidgen of positive growth in Africa, or Asia, first of all, at 0.1%. Africa is still to grow positive, except if you take out Nigeria, or if you bring in Nigeria and South Africa and Angola, then we look a bit different. But I mean, much of Africa is going to be growing positively, like Tanzania is still expected to grow 2.5%. But now South Africa is expected from these same institutions to decline with 7.2%, I think it is. One gets confused with all the numbers because they're so close. I think it's closer to 9, but it doesn't matter. The point is we're going to look very much like a developed country but we're an emerging market. We shouldn't be looking like a developed country on this graph. And what is interesting for me here, which I'm still working on, but is the lockdown frenzies. Everybody was saying, and it's quite certain the virus had an impact everywhere.
Yeah.
And yes, China did lock down partly. I mean, we must admit that, but half of China was still open. And India locked down terribly, but they locked down about the same time that we did, but they came from a higher base. But Indonesia didn't lock down. Taiwan didn't lock down. Vietnam hasn't locked down. South Korea hasn't locked down. Not talking about small regional, where and not sure about Malaysia now. Sweden, we know, didn't lock down. United States had quite a few states that weren't locked down, specifically the smaller ones, but they're still in positive territory. Philippines locked down, also late like South Africa. Norway, Switzerland, all of them, but Norway and Switzerland didn't lock down quite hard. And you must remember, they didn't only lose 3 or 4 days in March. They lost like 15, 20 days in March.
Yeah.
So compared to us, I think they're still doing quite well. And then my idea was Japan didn't lock down, but Japan is an aging population. They have other growth problems. But I think us and Japan are, sort of these laggards in our region. Japan is very much a laggard in Asia. The UK might become a better, but at the moment they're a bit of a laggard and Germany as well. Germany had a very good export thing, but Germany's now considered a bit of a laggard. But we've never been a leading. You could say, well, Japan, had 4-5 decades of excellent growth, and now they've had 2 decades of real crap.
Yeah.
We've never had, we had in the 60s for a decade long, but we haven't had decades full of great growth. And the other thing about Japan is, which people forget, and I'm getting a little bit carried away here on something else, but just while I think about it, they've got an aging population, they've got a shrinking population, and so does China, in a sense. So what you have is when your GDP goes down, say with 1%, but your population goes down with 2%, people are still getting richer.
Yeah.
People forget that part. And it's maybe not nice to say that, but sometimes one has to just see what the age impact is and so on. So Japan has seen a sort of no boom in babies for 30, 40 years. China's getting to the same position, but they've still got a younger workforce than Japan. Japan is a good 10 years older. So I think there's also something to be said about that. But nevertheless, this was done more to see what the impact of lockdown was.
Yep.
And we'll have to monitor it. And I agree, I must bring in more African countries. But I do know that there are quite a few that are growing, and there'll be some that'll be very terrible. Us, Zimbabwe, Zambia, I'm very sure will have terrible outcomes, and same with Namibia.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense to me. And it does fit the picture, especially with what the Reserve Bank's forecasts were. Earlier, was it last week, where it came out that we may be looking at like a 30% or something contraction in quarter 2?
In the second quarter, yes. No, yeah. Absolutely. We're looking at, seasonally adjusted and annualized, it could even go over 40%. Yeah, and I think your bounce back, though, for this quarter will then be, sort of nearly the opposite of that. If you decline with 30%, you're very likely to jump back with at least half that, 15%. But what that means, if you've declined with 30%, it's basically, let's say, a 7.5% decline, and then you have a sort of 3.5% increase, if you understand what I'm trying to say. Because we seasonally adjust and annualize everything as Nika. So, if you took April, you look at the passenger flights in April, it would have been, and you analyze that it would be 100%. because you look at the passenger numbers at all the big airports in South Africa, where we were at 1.5 million, all of a sudden you're at 5,000. So you've lost 99.9% of the people. And, that puts it into a perspective that we have to understand. Already June is looking better. It's not perfect. There is some holdback. And I am worried when the UIF stops paying. And I am a bit worried when the extra social grants stop. Worried about some of the businesses that have got payment holidays now. And it's going to make it difficult because then they have more money to pay back. And already I'm hearing from some of the people I know in the restaurant and the hotel industry, where the banks have given them off, or the landlords have given them off 3, 4, 5 months off on the rent. But they want that back over the next 3 or 4 years. So they gear up. And they've said, okay, we won't increase it with 10% a year anymore, because that's been ridiculous for a long time. No. But we'll increase it with inflation plus the money you owe us. So effectively, they're back into a 10% plus increase for the next 2 years after that. It's going to hurt a lot of them because they're not going to be able to charge that to their clients, who now many will also have not had the increases that they want, or may have lost their job. So it's a very, very slippery slope. I've heard some good news stories too. I've heard of a landlord that has given a restaurant off completely till the end of the year. Wants nothing back, is writing it off, say, I just want you to survive. And that, I think, is a very sensible approach in this case. But not all landlords can afford that. They have shareholders they have pensioners to pay. All those sort of things are very important in the whole big picture too.
Yeah, the one thing that stuck out for me, and I'll put a few questions up on the screen now. We've got a few very interesting ones. But one thing that stuck out to me when the government started coming out with the story about phased lockdowns, is that a lot of government officials and a lot of people don't seem to understand the organic nature of how an economy works. Is that you can't just selectively switch certain organs on in the body and keep other organs switched off and expect it to function, especially if you've got forward linkages, backward linkages between industries and between individual businesses and firms, which is the whole wonderful thing about how dynamic an economy is. Now we're talking about, okay, you guys are allowed to operate.
I'm going to ask you a question. Have you been in a shop recently and seen a few empty shelves?
Yes, quite a few.
Same here. Now, that is it. You see, you've stopped those people manufacturing at the steam because you're saying only 50% sun, and then they didn't. And now they're struggling with their suppliers as well because the supply chain coming into South Africa is under pressure. The ports aren't working quite as well as they should, particularly Cape Town now. But there's also evidence of PE. There's evidence of the Mozambique and Maputo border area. There's even, within the African continent context, there's a lot of these things. So now these guys can't manufacture, and you forget that you need the cocoa for the chocolate from overseas. And then apart from that, you need the milk factory to work quite fully. But the other thing is the farmer isn't working fully either, because he's still got to look after his children because they're not going to school yet. So all these things are impacting, and then you get to an empty shelf. Now, you may even have the money, but you might be a bit careful in these times. And you might say, all right, if my product isn't in, I'm just not buying it. If I don't have milk, I'll have black coffee. I'm just using it as an example, but that's where we are. And to untangle the supply chain mess is going to take a while.
Yeah.
To untangle the social net for people is going to take a while. That means the schools, the nursery schools, universities, all those things. Even if the children can be taught at home, it means a parent must be at home, or somebody in the parent's place must be there. And if those people have also got kids, so it's a knock-on effect, and they can't come because there's nobody looking after the kid of the domestic worker, say. So ultimately, it's a long road, and the same factors apply. And then there's the fear factor. We do not get away from the fear factor. People will not go to restaurants that easily at the moment or fly, because they fear of getting the coronavirus. But in the meantime, we now know old folks like me, we die. Young guys like you, you're flipping okay. You're flying this thing. And, children rarely transmit it. They get it, but they're asymptomatic. 585 hospital cases in the whole of Europe for over 2 months, and 21 countries, 78 of which went to ICU, 4 of whom died, 2 with comorbidities, and 1 had a cardiac arrest, so they are worried that it's probably not COVID. And that just shows you, if it was only really 1 child out of 80 million odd in those countries under the age of 18, then your chances of being struck by lightning are much higher.
Exactly.
So
and this is something
look at this.
I wish I could put this on replay and loop so that people could just listen to that segment a lot more. But it's absolutely true. So restaurants have opened. We went out for dinner last week, Wednesday or Thursday night, to a place down the road, which is normally absolutely packed 7 days of the week. I mean, you sometimes, if you don't book ahead, you're just going to be out of luck. You don't get in. We were the only patrons, the only 2 people in that entire restaurant. And I've seen other very popular restaurants reopen, then close again, and then reopen selective days that they've estimated would be their peak, so that they don't actually operate every single day.
They have to keep their costs down.
They have to keep their costs down. And then we flew up for a funeral in Johannesburg last weekend. So we flew Safair, which is now obviously the only airline I recommend people fly on because I'm very biased towards this. But the flight was chock-a-block full. It was a full 186 people out of 186 seats. But we must also bear in mind that there were only 2 flights between Cape Town and Johannesburg and vice versa on the day with Safair. So it was the morning and the afternoon. They have hardly any competition at this point in time. Mm-hmm. So to fill an airplane is not going to be the most difficult thing if there's that little supply. But there's, as you have pointed out, I think getting back to normality is going to take a very long time. I've got a very interesting question for you, though, from Sean Murphy, who's a long-time subscriber, and he says, "Hi, Mike. I've seen some online stories about a massive Chinese gold counterfeiting scam, but nothing on mainstream news networks. Have you heard anything from the financial side, or is this fake news?"
I have no idea, Sean. I'm sorry. I don't, the problem is with all these scams, there's so many of them. Just be aware. If it says it's easy money, be triple aware. And, there's a reason why some firms have built a reputation and some are building a reputation. You want to go to places that you know something about. And if you don't understand it, stay away. That's my simple advice. I don't know anything about the Chinese scams, though.
We've got a couple of questions from Brian Many as well. Firstly, he asks if you're going to join us for a whiskey at some point, which I'm sure you will. Yes. But he also asks, why would Namibia have such a terrible outcome? I've got my own ideas, but I'd rather let the professional answer it.
Namibia, like South Africa, came into this virus with a very bad track record. In fact, Namibia is competing with South Africa for the worst unemployment rate in the world. They also have localization policies that are not helping. Their tax to GDP is higher than us. They're paying over 15% of their GDP for government salaries. We're at 14.6%. Those are huge problems. I do think I like the people of Namibia. I love the country. I love that. But I think they just are in a bad neighborhood. They've also got bad policies. And they are not going to be able to get going if they don't change their policies. I want to say one thing, though, and I don't have any vested interest, but I was very amazed at a transport forum where I was and at other places, but how Namibia is marketing itself. If you look at Walvis Bay Harbour, I think they're doing a much better job. They have to, probably. And I think the other thing about Namibia is once that bridge, Kukuzani or whatever, between Zambia and Botswana near the Capri Reef Strip is gone. They will get a new background. They will become a trade hub more than they are now. So somebody like Walvis Bay will be the preferred supplier for Livingstone, which is 2 million people there, as much as Namibia, and they will become the distance from them to Lusaka and the distance from Maputo or Durban to Lusaka, the time period will be about the same. So up and until, say, 200 k's to Lusaka or whatever, they will have the great advantage with that bridge. And that also opens up parts of Angola on the eastern side. So I think it's an interesting thing where you can see a piece of infrastructure that was dearly needed will change at least some of the trajectory. But for now, they had as bad a policies as we did in South Africa, and they are coming short, and they're in even smaller markets, so they have to work so much harder to draw in investments. Majority of the investments they get come from South Africa. It is what it is, you know. Us, Lesotho, Swaziland, and Namibia all share similar currency, similar interest rates. With Botswana, similar tax rates, although Botswana is lower and much lower in some cases. But all these countries are very dependent on South Africa, and specifically also the countries that have got localization policies like BEE are making it very difficult for themselves. Their tax rates are high. That's the difference between us and Botswana. They don't have the same, yes, in the diamond and in certain mining areas they had that localization. They did more strategic, but if you want to open a workshop in Botswana, you open a workshop in Botswana. You know, I think there's a little bit more leeway there, and I think the governments of Botswana and certainly some of the other countries around here are opening up much more to business. And I get the feeling Namibia is also going in that direction than we are. I mean, if I go and look at not Zimbabwe, but how people like Zambia and Mozambique have tried to attract South African investments over the years. Not saying it's all turned out well, but the business people I've spoken to, smaller ones, have been very impressed by the friendliness and the eagerness of people. So I think we've got to realize that sometimes you know, the mistakes we make are common, but as we go into the future, we will become a little bit more uncommon to each other, because I think a lot of the African countries around us are also wanting growth, are also wanting to bring down their high unemployment rates and the like.
That's I think as solid an answer as Brian would have wanted, because he was born in back then called Southwest Africa, so he's a huge fan of Namibia. As we said, it's a beautiful country. Then because he's emigrating, he obviously wants to know what are your feelings on the rand over the next 6 months, because he still hasn't gotten his money out of the country.
Well, the strange thing is I'm a bit of a rand bull at the moment. I think the dollar has become too strong. We've now got a current account surplus for the wrong reason, because we're not importing enough. The demand isn't here. And that's why you're getting those empty shelves that you're seeing. So for the short term, I think, you know, the rand can come back. But the best way to do it, maybe, or a safer way to do it, is to say, switch some of your money now, some of it in 3 months and some of it in 6 months. And that way you get the average, which means you get neither the worst or the some, but it makes your planning easier. You know what you're going to have over there. And that, I think, is maybe something to, is also going to be appreciated, the ability to plan, so you know what you can afford, where you can go and rent or buy or whatever you're going to do. And I think that's important. But I think in the short term, and short term I don't mean today, I mean the next few months, I think the rand could make quite a bit of a comeback. Our interest rates are very attractive on the government bond side still. Our government debt is going to be a very big problem. I don't think it'll be a long-term thing. I think you want your money overseas, or a lot of your money overseas if you can, just for diversification. But with the sort of debt levels that the rest of the world is getting in, but for an emerging market, we'll be leading in the pack of emerging markets with debt problems. The likelihood of our currency having a long run strength is very unlikely. Can have a 6 month or a year long, I have no doubt about that. And we came back after 2001, after 9/11, everything went to America. 6-7 months later, we were back. The great financial recession, or great recession in 2008, 2009, we had a very weak currency. We had come back by 2010, 2011, and then we weakened again, by 2014 and so on. So we've had periods where we've had a strong rand in recent times, especially when you've had a strong dollar, because that's the other thing. We're the bath, they're the ocean. So when the ocean looks very strong, people throw a lot of water out of the bath into the ocean. But the ocean, also has a time period when it wants, and then there's very little that they can run to. And the rand, with its interest rates, they call it, let's call it a TINA currency. There is no alternative because our interest rates are still relatively high and above inflation, so it's attractive in that sense. So they will also look for diversification in times where they think the dollar is not going to be quite as strong. So I think we'll be stronger for the next year, maybe two, but in 5-6 years' time, I think we'll be weaker than today again.
I think that answers this question solidly. So I think to start moving towards the end, because you still have some work to do, I'm sure, today. Yeah. Especially with the truck driver strike, which is on and off, and you're probably getting hammered with what is your opinion on that from all sides. With regards to our trajectory, I think we've made it quite clear in the beginning that there's a lot of bad news, there's some good news. How does taxation fit into this for our outlook?
Gideon, that is the big answer, I think, that we should be looking at. We think every one of our problems just takes more spending. It doesn't. It takes more efficiency. And it takes better leadership, better thoughts, better people. Better people at the coalface particularly as well. And this idea that we can just spend money. If you're spending money but people go on strike the whole time, then it doesn't matter. So back to taxation. South Africa has the 10th highest tax rate in the world in 2017, which is the latest figures we have. We've been up around there the whole time, whether in 9th or 11th or 12th place. We've got a very high tax rate. As I showed just now, we don't have a great growth rate. We add to that tax rate by a localization policy. Madness. It is pure madness. And the taxes are so progressive that Oxfam says, no, South Africa's got the most progressive personal income tax in the world. That's not going to bring in investors. That is not going to bring in people to help you build an economy with their firms and everything. What you want is a more even spread. Yes, tax the people on top more, but at a much more slower rate. And just to put it into perspective, and this is not purchase power parity, so this is not an academic discussion. At 40,000 Rand a month, okay, and you get a 13th check as well, so you're just under 600,000 a year. You're 550, around there. You're earning that a year. In America, you would qualify for food stamps in most states, or not most, many states. In most states, you would qualify for federal housing assistance, whether as a renter or as a buyer of a home. In South Africa, we'd be paying tax at a rate of about 38%, your marginal rate. You would be getting very little back from the state. So when people look at this, and when practical people look at it, they don't look for the purchase power parity rate. That's what they look at. They say, well, if I'm in America, I get very good roads, my children are educated, Yes, I have to spend more on, let's call it healthcare. If I go to Germany, that's healthcare is included, and it's private. So you choose a healthcare scheme, but it's your tax money that pays for it, or your social security. So you're going to pay a few percentage points less tax. In Germany, you won't get much back in terms like in America in that sense, but where you get back is you don't have to worry about a medical aid. You choose your provider of healthcare. You choose your provider for education, which is the state in most cases, but it's a very good state, and you can choose schools as well. Different outcomes. You know the roads are good. You know the infrastructure is there. And, if you've got a company, you pay far less effective tax rates than South Africa. You say to yourself, why? And for that, I get policing. I don't have the crime rates. So when I compare South Africa to those sort of situations at sort of roughly the exchange rates that we are at now, it's crazy to want to attract people and businesses. If I'm an American company, what's my tax rate? 21%, but I can write off so many things. So the effective tax burden of American companies is 2% of GDP. Ours is 7% some years. Other years, in bad years, it's 5%. That's when we don't have the profit margins. There's no comparison. That you've got to look at this and say, companies are built on profits. Profit is not a swear word. It is really what brings people to that company as investors, as employees. It's an idea that operates, and companies don't have a forever rack space. The average company in South Africa does not make 5 years. Even in America, I think less than 20% of companies have got a 12-year history. So that shows you need that profit. If you don't have that profit, you don't get that new company formation all the time.
As someone who's worked for 2 unprofitable companies as an employee, you certainly want your company to make a profit. Otherwise, you're going to pack it in at some point, either voluntarily when you run away to greener pastures before the house of cards comes tumbling down, or you're going to be ejected with everyone else when the chickens come home to roost. And I really like that, because profit is seen as this swear word. It's part of our sort of neo-Marxist lexicon, unfortunately, in the media and in politics. And it's a thing also that struck me yesterday, is that not a single economy has ever uplifted the poor via taxation. I don't recall once in history that's ever happened. In fact, I'm busy with a very good piece of literature on Tudor England. Well, King Henry VIII. He essentially taxed the poor into increasing poverty in order to finance his wars against France and the Scots and whatever. But ultimately, that's what it always is. That's a very feudal example, but that's what happens. Any final thoughts?
Tax just on tax, if you tax the rich and ultimately the rich go away, you've effectively taxed the poor. South Africa is probably the country that has the biggest expanded social grant system per taxpayer, per personal income taxpayer in the world. We've got approximately about 7.5 million personal income taxpayers, approximately 19 million will go up for a little while, grant recipients. So that's more than 2 to 1. My problem with this is that you cannot take the work of a few to feed the many, because the many are going to be not satisfied. So you have to make the situation the other way around as a very minimum. So what you want is you want the 19 million people working, paying for 7.5 million. So what you want is you want more jobs, and you want more jobs, and over time you want them to pay more. So the first thing that you should be looking at is, how do I create work? And that means you need the very essence of what there's very few of. And in South Africa, only 2.3% of all adults are employers. They employ other people. Only about 4.5% employ themselves. So that is a very small amount worldwide. And that tells you something about company formation. Company formation is not happening in South Africa. And if it's not happening, if companies aren't forming, you will not help the poor. And you were very right. You cannot tax yourself to greatness or to richness. You can do it for a short period. We should have done it, say, for a 7 or 8 year period. Seen a lot of people through, but made it clear that that's it. You get 7 years of grants, and you have to find a way to work. And then you take the leash away from the business. You say, what rules don't you want? What can we do to make your taxation less? What can we do to put the infrastructure that you need, whether it is roads, bridges, water, electricity, down for you? Then it works. This idea that the state can do everything and can think for everybody, well, we only needed to listen to Minister Patel a few times to understand that that ain't going to work. And I think that's the one lesson we learned, hopefully. But yeah, that's it. And I think what's interesting from my perspective, because I know your background a bit, is, you know, everywhere around the world, airlines are in trouble. There's no doubt. Big time. I mean, this coronavirus has killed tourism. That's why Thailand, for example, is getting hit much harder than many other East Asian countries, because they rely on tourism. If you relied on electronics, it's a bit different. You know, you can still get that out on the sea and so on. But I'm very concerned that our government is only looking at one airline that hasn't worked for decades before. It needs to broaden its horizon and say, right, let's get out of the SAA thing. Let's help the airlines that were profitable before for, say, an average of 3 or 4 years. Let's put that there for them. Let's get this, and we get out of that business now.
Yep.
And we will take a 20% stake in Safi, a 20% stake in Comair and Airlink and Chemair and all those. But we take those stakes with a view of selling them either back to the same investors or to other investors later. But we want these airlines, and that's what they're trying to do in Europe with Lufthansa and so on. They're all in trouble. And this is the one state that's just looked at its own airline, which is never going to fly again. That's pretty much clear now.
It's pretty much doo-doo's dodo, flightless and extinct. It's not going to go anywhere.
And it's sad, because I used to work there 30 years ago, and I always think there were good people there. Yeah. But if you've ever seen an example of bad management, that airline's had the worst management for the longest time I can think of. Probably in the last 2 decades, it's gone from bad to worse to really, really worse. And gee, it can't go lower. Oh, yes, it can.
Just in case you were wondering.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you that Brian and Warren say thank you very much. It's been an outstanding session. As does Anton from the CEO Tip-Off Show. He recruited all his people to come watch. So thank you, Anton. Any final, as we wrap up, Mike, any final thoughts from your side about anything at all?
Don't get depressed too much now. Get your own act together. Don't worry too much about what other people other than your competitors are doing. Obviously, you need to know what your competitors are doing. That's my personal business advice. And make sure that you've got a plan in place. The other thing is, I think we need to spend a lot more time, and I'd like to see more shows of you and other podcasters of how the social work or this technology, Zoom and these Livestream and things are doing. What this one, StreamYard, all of them, and Microsoft Teams, I think it is. All those, forget all the names, how that's going to change, because ultimately I can take my work somewhere else, and many people can now. Yeah. And it's going to mean I'm going to think to myself, but maybe if I can earn American dollars, be my registered company, say, in Mauritius, just as an example, it changes the whole dynamic. And those are the things I think that we should be focusing on, because that is a positive contribution I think we can all make in our general thinking for everyone in this country, how we can move forward on those sort of things. Gideon, it's been very nice being on your show. It really has.
Thank you so much, Mike, for being here and giving us an hour of your valuable time. And I think I will take your challenge and I will come up with a program on exactly this, and I'll get some guests, and then I'll send you the video once we've done it.
I want to see that video. Because I'm not an expert in it, but I think that's a new way out.
I've got one or two. Brian's one, but he's a big fan of Cisco's WebEx, so he's biased, incredibly biased. I'm going to need some people to balance him. But on that note, I'm going to say, if you could just stay in studio for me a little bit, so I can say cheers to you in person after we've ended the broadcast. But to everyone who's watched, thank you so much. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And we hope this has been very informative, and hopefully we can do it again soon. From the two of us, thank you, and bye-bye.